US joins India in raising concerns over Canada becoming a terror haven. Security concerns over Canada's borders are growing, with both the US and India fearing that terrorists could exploit gaps to enter their territories. Tom Homan, the former acting director of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, that's ICE, highlighted the risk of the ill-guarded Canada-US border being used as a gateway for terrorists. Homan criticized the Canadian government for not prioritizing border security, which he said has been a vulnerability for over a decade now. India, too, has raised alarms about Canada's border security, particularly in relation to the Khalistani terrorists who have found refuge in Canada. India accuses the Prime Minister Justin Trudeau of being lenient toward these extremists, which India believes undermines its security. We're joined live by Andrew Latham, who's an author who's joining us live from Minnesota via Zoom. Good morning, Mr. Latham from India. Really just help us understand now that the US is also siding with India when it comes to the Canada's perspective on terrorism with the ill-guarded borders, really. How's that likely to play out between US and Canada as well?
It's going to be a source of tension. It is the longest unguarded border in the world, in a sense. And what that means is that people can cross that border, not quite at will, but pretty close to at. And there are a number of unguarded points, and there's some technicalities in Canadian law. But the bigger issue is not so much the undefended or open border. That's an issue. But Canadian domestic politics and how that intersects with the various Khalistani independence movements and how that connects to the ruling party in Canada, the Liberal Party, relies on those constituencies, and so is not inclined to prosecute various people. We'll talk about specific individuals in a moment. So it's not just that there's this open border. It is that this open border is being exploited, and then there is this broader Canadian political dynamic which creates space for Khalistani separatists and disinclines the ruling Liberal Party in Canada from prosecuting those people.
Professor Latham, now that Tom Homan criticized the Canadian government also when it comes to the border security itself, as you mentioned, even there's the rise of the Khalistani extremists in Canada. How is that really going to play out? Because there's been a growing unrest within Canada's borders as well.
Yeah, I mean, Canadians, like Americans, are increasingly concerned about the security of the borders. And there have been steps taken in recent months to change the laws and the regulations. Once upon a time, in the not-too-distant past, there was a difference between regulated entry points and unregulated. But now the entire border is subject to a common rule and a common law. But again, securing the border there is already a huge Indian diaspora in Canada. And part of that diaspora is a Punjabi diaspora. And part of that is a Khalistani diaspora. And that's really the issue here and this is why I can understand the government of India being irritated, to use a mild term, with Canada. Canada needs to get its act in order with respect to these separatist movements overseas. Canada and Canadians are torn. On the one hand, freedom of expression, free speech, right? We get that. That's wonderful. It's lovely. It's very Canadian. On the other hand, that person you're showing there, Justin Trudeau, his party in certain parts of the country, Brampton, where I grew up and where I'm now a minority, by the way, some suburbs of Vancouver as well, the Liberal Party really needs the support of not just the Indian diaspora, but the Punjabi and even Khalistani diaspora. I could tell you horror stories about what's gone on in my hometown of Brampton over the last decade or so around these issues. The basic point, though, is that the Trudeau government is not inclined to prosecute, to extradite, to do all of those things, which is why the Arshgal incident is really kind of interesting, because he was arrested in Canada. Now India wants to extradite him. And it remains to be seen whether he will be tried in Canada and treated, as a criminal in Canada, or whether the Canadians will turn him over to the Indian government to be tried as a criminal under Indian law.
Professor Latham, in the larger scheme of things, now that there's been criticism all around, as you mentioned, of the Trudeau government, do you reckon that the Canadian officials are likely to possibly strengthen the porous border along the US and Canadian borders, really?
I think so. It's 9,000 kilometers. It's a long border, a very long border. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police are meant, in conjunction with a few other Canadian government agencies, meant to police that border. And for a long time, hundreds of years, this has not been a problem. But now it is a problem. And when the Trump government comes in and it begins to talk about deporting people, a lot of people are going to say, I don't want to be deported back to my homeland. I'm going to make a run for the Canadian border. And the Canadian government is very concerned about this, which is why they've begun to tighten the borders in anticipation of what will be a potentially huge outmigration of undocumented migrants in America trying to get to Canada and claim refugee status or other statuses.
That's right, Professor Latham. Thank you so much for sharing your inputs and thoughts, really, on US also siding with India when it comes to the growing unrest in Canada. Thank you so much.